Welcome, everyone, to the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. I'm your host, Desiree Stanley. And with me today, I'm so honored to have Jill McClennen. Welcome to the show, Jill. How are you today?
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm doing excellent. It's spring in New Jersey. All my flowers are starting to bloom. It's beautiful. Makes me really happy.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. And it is spring. It is time for revival, right? All of the things are coming back. And not to get too far off before we even start, but it's kind of an interesting point because we're going to be talking about death and end of life, but also the flip side of that. And that's how do we live fully now while we are alive? And so you are the owner and founder of End of Life Clarity, and you are a death doula, or another way to say that might be end of life coach. And so you help families and individuals who are beginning to deal with this process and or are in the process of dying. And so I'm again so thankful to have you on the show to talk about this with us today. I love to have my guests share how it is that this came to be for them. So would you just start it off by telling us how was it that you developed End of Life Clarity as a company, as a philosophy?
It really started probably about 13 years ago. Actually, probably even before that. We'll go way back, right? When I was a child, my mom was a single mom. She worked a lot, like a lot of single moms that work a lot. My grandmother raised me. She was the one that I was there all day long, every day after school. I learned how to sew. I learned how to garden. I mean, I learned so much from her and we spent so much time together. And my husband and I, we were living in California and we had gone to college together. We moved to California. We were working in restaurants. And we said, we want to open a bakery together. And my grandmother said, I'm getting ready to turn 90. She was still in the house that my grandfather built for her in the 40s. So she lived on a farm and then she lived in this house. And she said, I really don't want to ever have to leave my house. And so if you come and you live with me, that'll be able to save you money on rent because I won't charge you rent because it'll keep me in my home as long as possible. And then you could open your bakery in Philly or wherever you want because we're in South Jersey. I convinced my husband, who's originally from Florida, to leave San Francisco to move to South Jersey. He loves me a lot. And so we moved in with my grandmother right about at her 90th birthday. Not too long after we moved in, she found out she had cancer. So we started the process of a 4-year journey of her going through surgeries and radiation and all these different treatments, which now the knowledge that I have, I would have probably made some different choices. But again, that's part of my journey. And so the last couple of months of her life, I had a 6-month-old baby. I was running a bakery at that point. My husband and I did open our bakery. So we were running this bakery together. I had the baby. It got to the point where they eventually said, we can't do anything else. We can't treat her for any more. We can't put her through anymore, basically. So who takes care of her? I said, oh, that's me. I live with her. And they said, okay, we're going to have hospice come out and help. And it was not the experience that I thought it was going to be because we don't talk about it. Nobody teaches you. Nobody trains you. It's not like the doctors or the nurses were like, by the way, as she nears death, this is what's going to happen. I thought she was just going to be grandma, sleep a lot, and then eventually pass away peacefully in her sleep. And that was not the experience that I had. The first night that she was home, it was really difficult for me because, again, I had a 6-month-old baby. So I'm like downstairs in the middle of the night with her because I heard her up moving around. And I'm literally like holding the baby, nursing the baby, trying to calm her down. And she's saying, my granddaughter has a baby the same age as yours. And I was like, I am your granddaughter. And she said, no, you're not. You're the nurse. And I was like, oh, wow, what is happening? And thank God for hospice. They're amazing. As soon as the hospice nurse came in, I was like, I'm exhausted. I'm confused. I'm overwhelmed. I was practically in tears. She was like, okay, let's sit down. Let's talk about it. It's all normal. It's all natural. As people near the end of life, these things happen. And over a period of about 3 weeks, hospice in the house, there was people coming in and out. They really helped me understand what was going on, so that then I could relax into it. Then I actually started really enjoying the nights when we were up together and the house was quiet and she was talking to people that weren't there and telling me about the women that were singing and all of these things that I was like, oh, this is really interesting, actually. So after she died, I said to my husband, I think I want to go back to school to be a hospice nurse. And he was like, whatever you want, honey. Like, you do whatever you want. But again, 6-month-old baby, owned a bakery. It was certainly not time to basically drop everything and go back to school and start all over. So fast forward to teen. At that point, I had 2 children. We'd closed our bakery. We had moved. We were working in quote unquote real jobs because we needed a better income than a bakery would give us. And I heard of a death doula on a podcast. At that point, I was getting ready to turn 40. It just like something inside of me was like, that's exactly it. That's what you're supposed to do. As I listened to this person explain what they do, and I thought, okay, there it is. And then I freaked out because I thought, oh my gosh, you're 40 years old. What are you thinking? A whole different career change from the last however long in food service to working with people at the end of life. You're not a nurse, you're not a doctor, nothing about it. But I couldn't forget it. It was just there kind of poking at me over the next few months. And so by January of 2020, I decided I was going to go for it and I was going to take an online training. But I had a full-time job, I had a part-time job, I had 2 children, I had my husband. Life was very busy. And so I thought it's fine. Even if it takes me a couple years, it's fine. I'm not in a rush. And then March of 2020, all of a sudden, I had a whole lot of time on my hands. And I ended up finishing my training. I finished a mentorship actually online with a woman in California who, at the time when I reached out to her, was like, I mentor people, but in California. And then when everything shut down, she was like, I can't see people in person anyway. We might as well try it. So I mentored with her in California and I had my business up and running by July of 2020, which was not in the plans. And I like to really, the business name, End of Life Clarity. I had this crazy spreadsheet with all these different words, and I was like trying to figure out the business name. I just kept going back to what is it that I want to give people as a business, as a support person? What is it that I'm trying to do? I realized that I was just really trying to help people understand the realities of death and dying, that it doesn't have to be as scary and overwhelming to really get clear on what you're going to go through, what you're going to experience, what's important. And so then I just kind of put a bunch of words together and ended up with End of Life Clarity. But I feel that it's really the mission of my business is really to help people and all people too. That's one of the misconceptions that people have is I get asked all the time, when should I call it death? Like when my person's dying? And I'm like, no, I mean, yes, you can. But ideally, you should really talk to a death doula, especially if you have any type of diagnosis, even if you're going to go through treatment. Let's start talking about these things. Let's start planning. Let's have the conversation, you and I, but then also I will help you have the conversation with your family members about what's important so that if the treatment works, quote unquote, works, and you're in remission or whatever it is that happens, that's great. Then you just put the plan off to the side and you worry about it later on. But if for some reason, if the treatment's not working, then at least at that point, I already know what's important to you. Your family knows what's important to you. And one of the things that I found too is, again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse. So when I started to learn about a lot of these different medical treatments and I started asking a lot of questions because I didn't understand, once I started to understand it, I thought, oh, people need to ask different questions. When we go in for cancer, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer a couple years ago. And I went into those appointments with her and I asked a bunch of questions. And we ended up deciding that at her age, we would do surgery. We would not do radiation or chemo. And her oncologist was really not very nice, was very pushy. If she gets it back again in 10 years, okay, fine. If she gets it back again in 10 years, we'll deal with it. But I know what radiation does to a person. I know what chemo does to a person. So she went through a minor surgery overall. She's living her life now. She's happy. She feels good. We're getting checkups regularly, making sure that everything's okay. But if I didn't know what questions to ask, we potentially would have started a treatment that would have worse side effects than really the cancer itself will if it comes back in 10 years. And we don't know these things. So that's part of what death doulas can do. We can help support at any age, at any stage of life through whatever it is that people are going through that makes us think about our mortality. Even if we're not going to die, if we get a cancer diagnosis, if we go to the doctor, even if we find a lump right away, I'm like, I'm dying. Oh my gosh, this is it. I'm dying. It's just a natural thing. And so working with death doulas at any of those stages can help ease that fear and that anxiety.
Oh my gosh, Jill, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that journey with us. And I think you're absolutely right. First of all, we don't know the questions to ask when we go to these because obviously we've never been through it before. And so many of us, and I mentioned this before we even started, don't want to look at death. We don't want to talk about death. We just ignore it. We run away from it. It's no, I don't even want to go broach that subject. And so we're just not prepared. And I think that what the service that you provide and the education that you're providing is so absolutely necessary to help through this process because we're just not prepared. We just don't know what to expect or how to handle it. And sharing your experience with your grandmother, thank you so much for that because I think that we don't know what to expect. And it certainly is different than maybe even what we had in mind. Like you said, you had no idea this was going to be the experience that you would have with your grandmother. And I think that many of us are in that same position where you kind of have an idea, but it's not necessarily going to go that way. And so again, what you can provide to people is tremendous to help them through this process. It's awesome. I think what you're doing is truly important. I just want to say thank you for that. But let's talk about how we can become prepared. And I think part of that is asking the questions, but how do we find out what those questions are, what they need to be to help us be prepared?
I know most people are probably not going to do the amount of research that I have done, right? A lot of it was just hearing a word, hearing about different things, looking it up, talking to people. That's partially why I started my own podcast because I was talking to so many people that I was learning from. And I thought people need to hear this information. So you don't have to know the questions yourself. You just have to know where to find the questions, find the resources, right? It's because it is a whole world that I can understand. You don't want to necessarily dive in head first, but that's why there are, again, death doulas out there. But even if, say, you're living somewhere and you try to find a death doula locally and you can't find one, a lot of the hospitals locally will have social workers. They'll
Mhm.
have a palliative care team, which most people don't even realize that palliative care is not end of life. It's not the same as hospice. So if you get a cancer diagnosis or any type of diagnosis that potentially could affect your life a lot, you can have a palliative care doctor, social worker, nurse practitioner. There's whole teams of people that just help you navigate that and will help you ask the questions that you need to ask, will help you understand. But again, if we don't know to ask for it, you're not always going to have it offered to you because I found that even doctors don't understand palliative care. I actually volunteer in two different hospitals. And that was one of the things that surprised me was that we were having doctors recommend palliative care for people that then we would go into the room and be like, they're actually dying. We should have seen them like months ago. Like, why are we seeing them right now? So even doctors don't always understand. That's why it's important for us, if we do get a diagnosis, to ask, is there somebody that can help me through this process? Because it's not always going to be offered. But palliative care is amazing. And it's one of those things that more and more, I think we're going to start seeing it. It's kind of not new, but it's new in that it's starting to spread more in hospitals and even some of the hospices locally to me also offer palliative care. As of right now, there's not a lot of like just strictly palliative care companies, but I think there will be moving forward once more people ask for it.
Yeah, and thank you so much for pointing that out because I'm not even familiar with that. I'm not even palliative care is new term for me and that what the services that they offer. So thank you for explaining that and saying that's an option. And I love that you said you don't need to know the questions necessarily. Just start asking for help and that can lead you down the path to the questions that you then need to ask, right? Because these are people who are experienced in it and can help guide you through the process. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And so I want to see if we can now kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about how this can lead us to living life fully now. And I think that many of us just assume that we're gonna have eons. We've got this is an infinite amount of time before death, and that's not the case. And we don't know when it's going to happen for any of us. And so how do we live fully now? How do we enjoy the life now? How do we experience life now fully?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things to talk about because I found for me, I was never really afraid of death. Like, even since I was a child, it was something that didn't frighten me. And so when I started to learn about death and dying and even grief, I wasn't surprised, but I was kind of surprised when I would get to certain things that would really affect me. It would really upset me a little bit, especially when it came to, unfortunately, people's children die. That's not something that I love to think about. That's a possibility that my children might die before me. But the reality is, it happens to people every day. And pretending that it's not going to happen to me is not going to keep my children safe any more than thinking about the fact that it could be me one day is going to make it happen. Right. So it was something that I was definitely avoiding altogether. I didn't want to think about it. I just was like, nope, block that thought out of my mind. As I started to learn and read more, and I was reading stories, I was like getting to those little pockets inside me that were like, oh, I'm uncomfortable. I don't like this at all. And I meditate. I've actually been meditating for many years now. I've been learning more and more about Buddhism and some of their practices and some of their beliefs. And so I know that avoiding things that make me uncomfortable is not going to keep me safe any more than thinking about them is going to make it happen. I was like, all right, I'm just going to sit with it. I'm just going to sit and be uncomfortable and realize that it's not me right now. I can't take it in. I can't personalize it, but I could still feel that sadness. I could still feel that grief and kind of experience some of it. I realized that the same grandmother that I was talking about earlier, her husband died when I was 4. And when I was 4 years old, we were very close. Again, like I basically lived in their house. And so one day he was there, one day he was gone. I wasn't allowed to go to the funeral. Nobody talked to me about it. I realized too that I actually had a lot of grief that I was holding inside over my grandfather that I had never processed. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to work through some of this old grief that I've been holding on to. So the more that I started working through some of these things rather than pushing them away, rather than being like, no, I don't want to think about it. I don't want to talk about it. I'm going to avoid it. I'm going to avoid it. I'm going to avoid it. Then I started to realize that life just felt different. Life looked different almost. Like it's hard to explain when I'll say to people, things just looked a little brighter, like a little shinier. I started noticing things more, little details about things. I started to really be more patient with my children and with my husband. I'm more intentional when I'm with my husband and my children because even if they are completely healthy, if everything's great for a really long time, I also know that this isn't going to last forever. One day I am not going to be here, right? One day I am going to be dead. We're all going to die eventually. And there was times in the past when I was so busy running around and just again I had 2 jobs and the kids were in clubs and sports and we were never together because we were always doing stuff that seemed so important. And the more that I understood that when people are dying, they're not thinking about the clubs and the jobs and the emails. And now, even with like social media, right? How many of us are constantly on our phones? It's so distracting. We're in the phones and we're scrolling and we're getting mad and we're making comments on people's things. None of that stuff is going to matter when we die. You know what's going to matter? Those times when we sat and we played games with the kids, even though we didn't think we had time. The times when we went for a walk together, the little things that we take for granted every day with our loved ones, because one day we're not going to be here and these experiences aren't going to be here anymore. And as I started to realize that, it really shifted the way that I live my life, where I understand, yes, I still need to work. I still need to grow my business. I still have to do these things. But now, if somebody says, hey, do you want to get on a call? And I look on my calendar and I'm like, there's a softball game or there's something at their school. I'm like, nope, I'm sorry, can't do it. Where in the past I would have been like, oh, I have to do it because they need me and I have to. And I was just putting the things that were actually really important to me behind other people's expectations of me and my time. It's been a process. I'm not saying it happened overnight. I still have to be aware and intentional of where I'm spending my time. But it really did change the way that I live my life. I live it differently than I used to. I'm so grateful for it because I really know that the path that I was on, I would have looked back and regretted so many things because our kids, if nothing else, our kids are only little for so long. Like I know everybody says that when it doesn't feel like that, when you're like, especially when they're real little and you're like, oh my God, but I just want to sleep through the night for once, please. But at the same time, again, if nothing else, they're going to leave the house. And that's one of the things too that I had learned that made me, I want to say, kind of live life a little bit differently is that we don't grieve properly in our culture. And there's so many things in life that come to an end that we don't grieve. And in some cases, things like when I became a mom, I was 32 when I had my son. I had a whole life before I had him. Even though I know sometimes it's hard for the kids to imagine I was a person before them, I was a person before them. And there's this feeling of shame where I really needed to grieve the fact that part of my life was over. It doesn't mean that I wasn't completely happy with being a mother. It doesn't mean that I didn't want my children. It just also means that part of my life was over. And rather than shaming myself and making myself feel like I was being stupid or that I was being selfish for feeling bad, that I couldn't do the things that I used to do, like just pick up and go places, once I really got okay with the fact that when things end, it's important for us to feel that grief, to feel that sadness, to honor it, then we can actually move on. Then we can really move forward and continue to live life. But pretending that grief isn't there and just shoving it down, it's going to come out eventually. And so when my children, quote unquote, grow up and leave the house, which they're 10 and 13 now, it's going to happen before I know it, as happy as I'm going to be that they're living their life, I am going to be sad. And there is going to be grief with that. And it's going to be exciting because I'll have more time now to have more opportunities to do things. But also, there's going to be that grief and sadness. And sometimes, again, reminding myself that even days when they're driving me crazy, I'm like, one day I am going to look back and wish that I was still here, even if it's not forever, right? Just 10 minutes, just 10 minutes, I would want to come back to this time. And I personally know because I do that now when I look back when they were babies. Again, when they were really little, I was so busy and I was just so not in a good headspace all the time. I just want to go back to when they were little, just for 10 minutes, just because I want to be there. I want to snuggle them. I want to just do it differently. I want to be more present. I want to be the mom that I wished I could have been then, but I just couldn't at that time. And again, I'm trying to work with not shaming myself, not feeling guilt about it, knowing that I was doing the best that I could, but also really happy that I do it differently now because this is how I want to be. I want to be present and I want to be there, imperfect as I am. I want to be there as much as I can be.
Yeah, that's excellent, Jill. So many great points that you made in there to remember the priorities, what's really important to us, the people who are important to us. And yes, we've got to work, we've got bills to pay, we've got to buy groceries, whatever, but it's choices about how we're going to devote the time that we have. That's really what people end up regretting when they're on their deathbed. And this is what we see a lot, right? People don't regret like that I didn't work enough. It's I regret that I didn't spend time with my family and my kids and the people who are important to me. So remembering that, where do you want to spend your time? And so I think that's a great point. And the I understand the children aspect of it. My girls are older now, so I'm on the other side of that. And yes, there are days when I remember them in their little onesie pajamas and can I just snuggle them again? And it's you had that time and that time is gone now, but just remember it fondly. And it was a great time for sure. There were days, as there always are days when you're just pulling your hair out, but they do go by so fast. And you look back on it and you're like, holy smokes, like where did that time just go? And so remembering that, enjoy those times. And I know I had people telling me the same thing. It goes by so fast. Enjoy it while it lasts. And what is the expression? The hours are long, but the years are short. And it's the day just felt like it went forever. And then you look back and now it's all gone. And remembering that, I think, is important. And choosing how you spend your time is important. Thank you again for kind of reiterating that and sharing that with us. So, what do you think that are maybe some steps that people can take, or maybe how we can shift our mindset so that we're looking at it from that lens? Like, how do we enjoy this time? How do we live now?
Yeah, it's definitely not something that, because again, most of us have avoided thinking about the fact that we're going to die and that the people that we love are going to die. So I'm not saying that people need to just like dive in head first into that swimming pool. Like you can take your time because it can be overwhelming to look into these things, to think about these things that we've avoided a really long time. But avoiding thinking about it is not going to make it any easier when it's time for us to face it. So, even listening to this podcast today, right? This is an important first step of listening to it and then being a little bit uncomfortable and being like, it's okay though. Like we can be uncomfortable. We can survive being uncomfortable. It's not going to kill us. And one of the things that I realize is probably most of us have never actually said, I'm going to die, right? Like we don't say that out loud. It even thinking it, sometimes people are like, oh, it's too much. It's too much. I can't deal with it. And I'm like, but it's okay. Again, saying it doesn't mean it's going to happen to me tomorrow. So sometimes just really thinking about that. I have a Facebook group that I love because I consider it like what they would call a death positive group where every day I post a different question. Sometimes it's about death, sometimes it's about grief, sometimes it's about living life. And it just kind of starts people thinking about these different topics and kind of working through them. And it's like anything else, the more that you do it, the easier it gets. Where when we avoid something, we get so nervous and so anxious about it, right? Where it's, oh, it's going to be terrible. It's going to be the worst thing ever. And then once we do it, it's, oh, that wasn't as bad as I thought. So even just starting to have conversations with your friends and your family, that's one of the things that I found as well is that I didn't really like going to parties. I didn't really like being around a lot of people because it just felt so superficial. It was like gossiping or talking about like sports or like things that I just was like not interested in at all. Now, when I go to parties and people say, oh, what do you do? And I'm like, I'm a death doula. They either run away from me or we have really amazing conversations, really good conversations, because this is the stuff that is really, again, this is what makes life worth living, those deep connections, even if it's only for an hour at a party and I never see the person ever again. I guarantee that both of us remember that conversation more than if we would have just been standing around and, oh, so what do you do? How old are your kids? Like the normal chit chat. And so it's just have the conversations with your friends and family. Just start talking about things that are a little bit deeper than the normal chit chat that we do every day. And again, get off the phones. And I'm not shaming anybody with it. I still struggle with it as well. But so often I realize now that when people are together in groups, we really are just so focused on these little boxes, not having the conversations, not having the connection. And then that's when I think to myself, I actually do this little like game with myself sometimes that probably will sound a little weird, but sometimes I'll be like, what if I was a ghost and I was observing this situation as I'm dead? I can't participate in this at all. Would I be sitting on that phone still? Or would I be like, no, I would want to be talking to my people. I would want to be touching them. I would want to be touching the plants and the flowers around me. All these things that I wouldn't be able to do that I could do right now. But instead, I'm sitting here staring at a screen, getting annoyed by what I'm reading. And it really does actually get me to put my phone down and be really more present because, again, one day I'm not going to have the ability to talk to my family. I'm not going to have the ability to garden or to eat food, right? All these things that we're not going to be able to do one day that we really take for granted now. And so sometimes I play that little game with myself and it really kind of forces me back into the moment of no, you would certainly not be sitting on your phone if you had any opportunity as a ghost to be like, no, but for 5 minutes, you get to interact with the world around you. I would not spend it on a phone. And so it helps me be a little bit more present sometimes.
That's excellent. I love that idea of putting yourself kind of in that thought. How would I react? What would I do differently? I think is a great kind of mind game to play with yourself. Good stuff. Thank you for sharing that. And it certainly made me think, absolutely would not be on my phone. And you're right. There's flowers to smell. There's the air to feel outside. There's so much to see and do and people to talk to. And so I love that as an excellent reminder of how to live in the moment and be present and enjoy that while we can. Yeah,
Yeah.
good stuff. And I think a good way to shift that because it is so easy to just sit on your phone and it is so easy to doom scroll and like you said, argue with people on the internet about something, which is totally pointless when you've got your loved ones right there present with you. That's your time is better served being with them than the other. So thank you for that. So you mentioned earlier about the podcast that you have, and it's Seeing Death Clearly. I would love for you to share with us what it is that you're talking about on the show. And do you have guests? And how frequently do you have episodes air?
I do a weekly episode, but again, now I'm starting to take a break. So I take a break for spring break. I take a break in the summer. We go on vacation. Both my kids have birthdays in December, so I take the month of December off. But I do put out a episode every week. I almost always have a guest because that's really what started me with wanting to create the podcast was I was getting on phone calls with people and I was like, this is really amazing information. I'm learning so much. Plus, I'm having really easy, comfortable conversations with people about death and dying and grief. And I think it's important for people to hear conversations. They're not morbid, they're not heavy, they're not scary, they're not overwhelming. It's just a conversation. And the more that we can hear other people talking about it, the easier it will be for us to have those same conversations. And then, of course, it's been really amazing because now I get to interview people that would never talk to me. My kids, again, 10 and 13, so they're into YouTube and all their YouTubers. And my daughter, one day, I was literally screaming when I realized that somebody that I really admire in hospice was going to be on my podcast. And she was like, what are you? And I was like, Barbara Carnes is going to be on my podcast. And she was like, all right, no idea who that is. And I was like, imagine if your favorite YouTuber agreed to get on a podcast with you and have a conversation with you. I was like, that's how I feel right now. And so I got to have a conversation with Barbara Carnes, which again, probably most of your listeners are going to be like, who? But believe me, she's a really big deal in the hospice world. She's an educator. She's been in hospice since the 70s, since it began. She's amazing. And so it was really a great opportunity for me to have a conversation with her. And then again, share that with everybody so that people can learn about different realities around end of life. But also, I interview people that aren't famous in any way. They're just somebody that says, hey, one of the women that I interviewed, her sister died when they were younger. She wanted to share that story. Amazing. Come on the podcast. Like, I love to just talk to all different people. And I did actually do in March, my aunt died, and I was able to be with her for the last 2 weeks of her life. And I was able to be with her the moment that she died. And so I did a solo episode. I did actually 2 episodes where it was 2 days after she died, and I recorded, I mean, and I like cried a little bit through it. I mean, it was really personal and really emotional. But again, I wanted to share with people how different the experience was because of the knowledge that I had and what I would have done different, what I did well, like my experience, how I didn't expect some things to make me feel so sad, other things I was really happy about. So that was the only time I ever did a solo episode. Because for the most part, I don't like just talking at myself. Like that's just not my jam, but I love to talk to people. And so that's how most of them go.
Oh, thank you for sharing that with us. And something that when you were describing that you have guests on and you're talking about this specifically about death and dying and the hospice care and stuff, it kind of made me think of exposure therapy and how this could be good for people who are maybe avoiding thinking about death or talking about death. That this is a kind of an easy way to begin to get into that and expose yourself to this that is something that is scary for you in a safe way,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, for
Yeah. So,
sure.
yeah, excellent. Good stuff. I'll include the information about your show in the show notes so that people can find it and take a listen because I think that it's important what you're doing and having these conversations so that people can hear and learn and grow and begin to accept. So I think that's awesome. And something else that kind of was sparked by what you said, and that we don't say, I'm going to die. And what I thought of is, and you kind of really expressed it, is how we think that when we say it, it's going to happen like immediately. A lightning bolt is going to strike me because I've just said that. But when we can say the things that scare us, they lose that ability to scare us, right?
Yeah.
So I think that it's important to remember that when we can talk about the emotions, the feelings, the things that are scary or we're uncertain about, they become less scary or uncertain. And that's important. So I had to share that because that came up for me. Okay. I want to, as I love to ask all my guests, have you share with us if there's books or podcasts, other podcasts that you want to share that you think would be helpful or beneficial for the listeners. Sharing those with us now would be amazing.
Yeah. At this point, I don't listen to as many podcasts as I would like to, partially because it's one of those things that I used to listen to a lot when I was driving a lot. And now I just don't quite as much. But I do read a lot of books, again, especially now about death and dying and grief. There's so many really interesting books out there. One of the ones that I read recently, if people do want to get a little taste of some of this medical stuff that I was talking about, there's a retired hospice chaplain whose name is Hank Dunn. And actually, I got to have Hank on my podcast. I was very excited. But his book, I actually read it way before I had him on the podcast, and it's called Hard Choices for Loving People. And he explains in really simple terms some of these medical treatments that, again, my experience with my aunt, that book actually was one of the most helpful things for me. So that when they were saying she needs to be intubated, in the past, I was like, I don't know what that is. Like you see it in movies, you see it in TV. It's not the reality. It explains CPR, it explains feeding tubes, it explains some of the things that you will probably get asked about if a loved one is nearing the end of life or in a hospital. So that was a book that was really helpful for me. Barbara Carnes also has written books about death and dying, really easy to read. They're not something that's like super technical, really difficult. I mean, I love to read. I always have stacks of books, so like all over the place because I find there's just so much really good information out there. And you don't have to dive into it all at once. It's not something like you sit down and you read it like a novel, but at least it's something that if you have it, you could read through it a little bit and just learn a little bit more as you go and take your time with it because you don't have to learn it all today. It's okay.
Yeah, good stuff, Jill. Thank you for that reminder. It isn't like you have to know it all right this minute. I'll include the books that you just shared with us in the show notes for the listeners as well. And thank you for kind of telling us a little bit about what they feature because it's important, I think, for us to know that there are resources. There's books, there's Google search, there's people out there like yourself who we can reach out to and learn from and get the information, but it doesn't all have to happen today. It can be a process. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for coming on the show. And I mean, we barely touched on this topic. And I know there's so much more that you do in working with people to kind of heal trauma and grief and dealing with sadness. So if you would share with us, like if people have questions for you, how would they be able to reach out to you? Is there a website you want to share or any social media links that you'd like to share? That would be awesome.
So I'm at End of Life Clarity everywhere. So Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. That's also my website. My website has links to the podcast, to blogs, to all of my social medias. So people are always welcome to email me, find me on Facebook. I'm just Jill McClennen. It's just my name. I'm always happy to talk to people. Again, even join my Facebook group. It's a nice way to kind of just start having a little bit of a conversation. I even have a lot of people that will say, I never answer your questions, but I read them every day. And every day I will think about the question that you posted. And I was like, that's amazing because that's what I want to do. I don't even sell in my Facebook group. It's not like one of those groups where it's like people just selling all their courses. It's really just I post a question every day. I get in the comments, people comment because I love having this way for people to gently start thinking about these things and talking about them. But for real, find me on any of the social medias or email me, Jill at End of Life Clarity. I'm happy to just talk with people.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And absolutely, I'll include all that information in the show notes. And I love that you said that you ask a question every day. And it's not that people have to necessarily respond in the comments, but that it's just really to get those wheels spinning in your head, right? Just think about this topic and answer it for yourself because really that's what's important is getting you to think and how would you handle it or what are your thoughts around it? And that's what's important. So good stuff. Thank you again, Jill, for coming on the show. I so appreciate your time and your knowledge and sharing this with us. And it's just been a delight. And so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation and I love to talk about all of the hard things that most people avoid. So I appreciate you giving me the space to talk.
You are quite welcome. Thank you again. We'll talk more soon. Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in to another insightful episode of the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. We appreciate your time and curiosity as we explore fascinating topics together. If you enjoyed today's discussion, be sure to join us next week for another amazing episode. Remember, your journey of learning and growth is a continuous adventure, and we're thrilled to be part of it. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next week, stay curious and keep exploring those pockets of knowledge.